Well, so, okay, so you got your mediation team in place, and how did you go about getting started?
So I'm going to try to telescope this answer, but it's very complex. The more I read, the more I talked to the lawyers, the more I thought that, the more I became convinced that the case was huge. It was sprawling, many tentacles, reaching many different parts of the life of the city and beyond the city. But it seemed to me that the case was primarily bookended by the pensioners, their pensions and their retiree health benefits. On the one hand, at the time, the pension funds were officially, the state had said they were $3.5 billion underfunded. Actually, they were
billion
with a
billion.
Actually, they were much more because the city had been using a very optimistic discount rate, which allowed it, I won't get too technical here, but it allowed it to contribute much less than was really needed to the pension funds to fully fund them. So on the one hand, there were, and the retiree health benefits, which, as I said, was at least $6 billion. So together, between the health benefits and the pension benefits, they were the largest single creditor on the block. There were a lot of financial creditors whose debt approached that, but to get taken together. But the retirees were really the largest. So on the other side, and we haven't discussed this just yet, but it was critical to the bankruptcy, the city had no assets to speak of. This was basically an assetless bankruptcy, except for one asset, a very, very big one. The city owned the art museum, the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is one of the leading museums in the world. The artwork had been donated to the city when the city was flush at the turn of the 20th century. And, the estimates of the value of the art was anywhere from $1 billion to $8 billion, 66,000 pieces, and the city owned it. Now, the ownership wasn't always clear because much of the art had been dedicated with constraints on it and restrictive covenants. So the ownership, that was a big issue. And whether the creditors could actually impair the art and liquidate it was a big question. But there was a lot of discussion in the media about whether the museum, which is really a matter of civic pride for Detroit, because people come from all over the world to visit, and whether the city was going to liquidate the art was a big question to pay off creditors. And as I was reading about it, I was becoming more and more aware that in a very real sense, the bankruptcy was bookended by the art on the one hand and pensions on the other. And there was a lot of discussion in the media and among the legal community, among the art community worldwide, about whether art could be liquidated for the benefit of a city's creditors. And there was also, I have to say, there was unfortunately an underlying racial narrative that was developing, because the pensioners were largely African American, and the art was being portrayed, it wasn't true, but it was being portrayed as sort of the exclusive province of the suburbs and the wealthy white community, larger metropolitan community. Wasn't true, but that's how it was being portrayed in the media. So there was this narrative, and there was almost a binary equation being presented. Either the art, liquidate the art, and everybody goes away happy, particularly the retirees, or the retirees, and if you don't liquidate the art, they're probably going to take a 30 or 40% cut to their pensions. And these were not plush pensions. I think the civilians got, I believe, 19,000. I say the civilians, I mean the clerks, the garbage men, the non-uniforms. And the uniforms got, I think, on an average of $32,000, but they didn't get Social Security. So, there was this very robust narrative being developed, art versus pensions, and I was very aware of it. And in my calls with the lawyers introducing myself, get their input on what they thought about a team approach, what they thought about their particular issues for their creditor families. Um, all of the conversations were very collegial. Everybody said they thought mediation was a good team. They wanted to cooperate, but pretty much all of the conversations ended with the same question: what about the art? And I should say that the Kevin Orr, who was the emergency manager who had been appointed by the governor to basically take over the city, had hired Christie's auction house to appraise the art. So the city was very focused on the value of the art, as they should have been. It was a bankruptcy. And so the more I thought about it and the more I kind of obsessed over it, really, the more I just sort of thought about this as being bookended by the art and the pensions. And I thought if I could find some way out of this trap, this binary equation that I was being presented with, maybe that would be a resolution. So, I remember thinking one morning when I got up, when I was golfing down on my golfing vacation with Jake, I remember thinking, what the hell have I gotten myself into? I mean, my legacy is going to be the guy who helped sell off one of the world's great art collections to sheiks in Dubai and oligarchs in Russia. And that was certainly something I didn't want. But I also thought it was a very bad idea for the city. I mean, I did some deeper dives into it, and I saw that about 550 to 600,000 people were coming into Detroit to visit the art museum, which was in Midtown, which was about the only area of the city that was beginning to have some nascent growth. And I thought that if you liquidate the art, it'll be like dropping a hydrogen bomb in the middle of the city. It'd suck the life out of it. And I went online and I looked at the board of trustees for the museum, and it was kind of a who's who of not just Detroit, but the greater metropolitan Detroit area and even beyond. And I could see the trustees were not just going to go away. They were already putting together a war chest for litigation to oppose the liquidation of the art. They had two very large firms, one a local Detroit firm and another a New York firm, Cravath, I believe it was at the time. So, and they were raising money for a litigation fund. So they weren't going to just go away, and that would extend the fight maybe for years because there were many, many legal questions. And that wasn't good. Steve and I, when we first talked about it, we both knew that time was Detroit's enemy. The longer this stretched out, the longer the city was in bankruptcy, the more vulnerable it was to the same kinds of service deficiencies and population loss. Detroit had lost about 60% of its population since the mid 1950s. The population at the time of the filing was about 700,000 people. It had been close to 2 million. So, this was not a good thing. And unless we got through the bankruptcy quickly, as quickly as possible, Detroit was going to continue to circle the drain. It was headed toward oblivion. I mean, there was no question about it. Anyway, these thoughts were all in my mind in kind of a big jumble, but I got up one morning and made myself a cup of coffee, I don't know, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, and sat down, and in front of me, I had been taking notes on all of my conversation, and I had gotten through the legal pad, and in front of me was the cardboard backing that I had started taking notes on. And I had this idea. I just had this idea. It wasn't like, a lightning bolt, but it was more the culmination of all of these conversations I'd been having with the lawyers, the reading I'd been doing, and my thoughts about the art and the pensions bookending the bankruptcy. And I had this idea, and I'm kind of a compulsive doodler anyway. I often doodle ideas and thoughts, and anything. So I doodled this little schematic, and in the far left, I put state with a circle around it. In the middle, I put art with a circle around it, and on the right, I put pensions. And I had this idea that if I could get the state to agree to kickstart funding to save the art and mitigate the pensioners' losses, put the art into a public trust, and then use that trust to flow money through to the pensioners, that maybe I could get the pensioners off the runway and then turn to all of the other creditor issues. It was a pretty crazy idea, but then I drew a square around the art to indicate we were going to lock it off from all the other creditors, which I knew would not be popular with the other creditors, to take the only asset that the city had, give it to one group of creditors and keep it from everybody else. But that was the thought. And then I had a bunch of questions that I wrote underneath it. How much would be needed? I had no idea. How much time would it take? Could we get the federal government to participate? If the state did contribute money, what would the state get? I thought maybe the state could get art sharing around the state. Maybe even state could be one of the owners or boards on a board of directors. Lots of very general ideas. And I knew that we would not be able to get enough money from the state just politically. We would not be able to get enough money from the state to do what we needed to do. So I had some thoughts about other potential ways to do some fundraising. And I wrote down private donors, foundations, and then the DIA itself. Because I thought, if we could buy the DIA's independence from the city and from the city's creditors, they should have some skin in the game. So that was the idea. Wow. Now, at the end of the week, I took this little doodle, my notes actually, and put it with the rest of the reading that I had, put it in a travel bag, brought it back with me to Detroit, took it out of the bag, put it in a pile behind my desk, and forgot about the doodle. Totally forgot it. It was just another doodle. But I didn't forget about the idea. And that was the idea that animated the ultimate resolution. Today, that doodle is hanging in the Detroit Institute of Arts.
Amazing. That's
pretty crazy.
That is amazing. And that's called the grand bargain.
That's called the grand bargain. People refer to the entire bankruptcy as the grand bargain, but really the grand bargain, at least the core of the grand bargain and the core of the entire plan of adjustment, was the deal. And ultimately we got, and I could talk to you as much or as little about how that got put together, but ultimately, after many full, frank, and conversations with my friend the governor, who had worked for me years and years before, in which he told me very nicely, but clearly, no way, or can I get money for Detroit? Very clearly. Ultimately, we got $350 million from the state and from the foundations. And this is a great story. It's way too long to tell, but from 14 different foundations, we got $370 million. And then we got, and this is another great story. The grand bargain was sort of a triple bank shot. It was the state, the foundations, and then the DIA. And with a lot of negotiation and some help from the governor, which culminated at a breakfast between the governor and the chairman of the board of the Art Museum in Washington, when the governor was receiving an award related to his support of the arts. He took Gene Gargaro, who was the chair of the board of the DIA, aside at the breakfast and persuaded Gene to commit the DIA to raise $100 million. And the governor called me right after this breakfast and said, I could tell immediately his voice was kind of ebullient. And he said, I had a very productive, he has a high pitched voice. I had a very productive breakfast with Gene Gargaro. I said, great. How productive? He said, I got you $100 million. I said, really? He said, yep. Just like that. So, you always want to beta check these things. So I didn't call Gene immediately to double check, but Gene called me and I said, so how did the event in Washington go? How did you had breakfast with the governor? And he said, this is a verbatim quote. He said, that was the most expensive damn breakfast in history. So, we raised, and then through another deal I did, the so-called haircut at the haircut, we got another $56 million for the retirees. That was a deal that I did with the UTGO bondholders. Very long story, but we took $56 million out of the tail of the dedicated funds, the millage funds, and put that on top to help the retirees. So that we did that deal, at least the kernel of the deal, with two lawyers and I and the governor on the phone at my then 78-year-old Italian barber's. So that became known as the haircut at the haircut.
So all of this that you're talking about is a very proactive role of a mediator. And could you talk a little bit about how that proactive role is different than a typical mediation?
Well, let me start with background about mediation, at least my experience in mediation. Mediators and mediation are sort of on a spectrum. There is purely facilitative mediation, in which the mediator sort of talks to one side, gets their views, takes it into the other room, gives it to the other side, and is basically, the mediator is facilitating but carrying messages back and forth. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is a much more robust role for the mediator, and that's known as evaluative mediation, in which the mediator doesn't just carry messages, but gives the parties his or her view of the case, the legal issues in the case, possible solutions in the case. And certainly the more complex a case is, the more evaluative and the more proactive a mediator has to be. I would say I am probably a more proactive mediator than most. My rate is pretty high, and I don't think people pay me the rate that they pay me for me to carry messages from room to room. I think they want to know what my views are, and they want to know if I have any creative ideas. So, I've done a number of bankruptcies since then, not municipal, but bankruptcies. And each of those has required me to be proactive in one way or another. In one case in New York, I can't give too many details, but this was part of the plan of adjustment, so it's public. I created a series of waterfalls for the various creditors in the case, so that each one agreed to how much of the waterfall it would get. Each creditor or family agreed to how much. Now, of course, within each waterfall, there were sometimes a lot of different creditors, and they had different tenors of security. So I was pretty proactive in that, in selling that to all of the creditors, getting them to agree. But we were able to create a creditor waterfall that eventually all the creditors agreed to. And many other ways to be proactive. I do a lot of large complex cases with a lot of moving parts. So I think a purely facilitative approach would be very difficult. And in bankruptcy, because there's large bankruptcies anyway, because there are a lot of creditors usually with arguments about the tenor of their security, requires the mediator to address all those arguments and deal with all those creditors if you're trying to get a confirmable plan of adjustment.
So you're talking about a spectrum of mediation that goes from the facilitative to the evaluative and all fall within the mediation spectrum. But in Detroit, you're
Well,
going.
let me say one other thing. I mean, this is my personal view. There are a lot of mediators who would disagree with this. But in a complex case like this, if the mediator doesn't get involved and doesn't have a plan, mediator is going to get run over, because these are tough cases with very experienced lawyers, who often have significant resources to put into the fight. And the mediator's got to be just as resourceful, just as strong, just as ready to engage as the lawyers are. And if the mediator doesn't have a plan of engagement, I think the mediator is going to get run over. That's my view. I know that's not a typical view of a mediator, but I don't do many typical cases either.
Well, to me, the idea of a spectrum and the type of role that a mediator plays depends on the type of the case, and it can be anywhere on that spectrum. Is kind of.
Now, let me say, even in the most proactive sort of role, the mediator's got to facilitate. I mean, it just goes with the territory that you're going to be listening to the parties, telling the other parties, where the push-pull is on the other side, what the arguments are. So even in the most proactive, evaluative approach to mediation, the mediator is going to be pretty proactive.
But in Detroit, even beyond
Or
evaluative,
pretty facilitative.
Yeah, even beyond the evaluative role, I mean, the mediator team was identifying the issues to be discussed, and
Sure. Yeah, and we required, not surprisingly, memos, mediation statements, pretty full-blown, robust mediation statements from all of the creditors, really. They each had their own view, and even within the creditor families, they had their own view. Every creditor of the financial families, everyone thought they were secured and had the highest tenor of bonds. And their insurers, who were the ones ultimately on the hook, certainly thought so.
And in this case, there was even a constitutional provision relating to pensions, right?
There was, and that was a big issue. It was a threshold issue in the case. Michigan's Constitution had a provision that I won't quote it verbatim. At one time, I could quote it in my sleep, but Michigan's Constitution had a provision which purported to guarantee the municipal and state worker pensions, but it was couched as a contractual right. You and I know, and everybody listening probably knows, that it's one of the sad facts of bankruptcy life that contracts get impaired in bankruptcy all the time. So that was a threshold issue, but it was a threshold issue with a very, very large human dimension to it. And because if you impair the contracts, the so-called contracts, which were really the pensions of all these retirees, that was going to have a very significant impact on many, many people. I'll never forget the first meeting that I had. Eugene Dreiker was my co-mediator for the pensions, as I said. We met with the retirees, and I will never forget the president of the civilian retirees, I call them the civilians, who was at the time, I think she was 77, 78 years old, very elegant African-American woman, very smart, very eloquent and articulate, stood up and she looked at me. She looked right at me. And she said, "Judge, I love the DIA. I take my grandchildren to the DIA. But if it's a question of some pictures hanging on a wall or feeding my family, that's not a hard question." And so that was Shirley Lightsey. And then Don Taylor, who had been a street cop for 30 years. He was president of the Uniform Association, Police and Firefighters Association. He stood up. And if you sent to central casting and you wanted a character that looked like a 55-year-old street cop, they would send back Don Taylor. He had a shock of white hair, a bull neck, and kind of a gravelly voice. And he looked me right in the eye and he said, "Judge, I represent people who run down dark alleys trying to get people with guns in one of the most violent cities in the world." And then he paused and he said, "And their widows. And I represent people who run into burning buildings to pull women and children and men and their pets out, and their widows. And the city's going to tell me they're going to cut my pensions? I don't think so." Just like that. I mean, boom. And it was pretty graphic. So there was really a human dimension behind these contracts. These were not just contracts. There was really a human dimension behind them. The legal issues were very difficult because you had this, on the one hand, you had this state constitutional provision. On the other hand, there was a bankruptcy. And there was also a question lurking in the background about, well, if the city didn't have a contractual obligation, did the state have some sort of backstop guarantee obligation because it was in the Constitution? And when I first got turned down by the state, and not just by the governor, but by the Speaker of the House, by the Majority Leader of the Senate, I pointed out to them that, maybe the pensions weren't guaranteed by the city, but the state might have some obligations here. I said, "Are you really going to tell the people of the state of Michigan who work for the state, who work for the cities, that the state has no role to play in affecting the constitutional provision?" And I wrote, we had a very robust memo prepared on that I used to advantage.
And in terms of addressing that constitutional issue, the bankruptcy judge ruled on that, correct?
Bankruptcy judge ruled right at the beginning, at the same time as he ruled that Detroit was insolvent, which was the easiest question in the case. At the same time as he ruled that Detroit was insolvent, he ruled that the pensions could be impaired. But he put a caveat in and said he was not going to do that lightly. And I think that was the right message to send to to all of the creditors and to the city. It was the right message to send.
And in the end, all agreed, and you had a consensual plan.
We did. We had a fully consensual plan within 16 months. Every deal was difficult. Every deal was unique. And every deal took a lot of time and a lot of patience and incredible talent of my mediation team. I'm just so proud of the team we put together, and we operated seamlessly as a unit, really. We met frequently. We emailed at all hours of the night, reporting to each other issues that had arisen, sort of trying to get everybody's views. And we got a fully consensual plan. I should say a word here because one of the real heroes of the bankruptcy were the foundations. They had never funded private municipal bankruptcies before, to say the least. But when I was getting nowhere with the state, I happened to run into the woman who is still the head of the Community Foundation for Southeastern Michigan, which sounds kind of like an innocuous thing, but it's one of the largest community foundations in the country. And more importantly, she was very connected in the philanthropic world. I ran into her at the delicatessen across the street from the courthouse, and she asked me how things were going. And I said, not so well. Detroit doesn't have a lot of assets other than the art. And, it's not a great idea to liquidate the art. And we talked a little bit, and she said, well, let me know if I can help. And I said, I've got an idea I'd like to talk to you about. So she came over a couple days later, And I had Eugene there, and we talked to her about this crazy idea of, what became the grand bargain. And I said I wasn't getting any help from the state to kickstart the funding. Do you think the foundations might be willing to get the ball rolling and kickstart the funding? She looked at me like I was crazy, and she was very courteous, but she said, "How much do you know about foundations, Judge?" I said, "Not much, except that I know they have a lot of money for good causes, and we're a good cause, and we need a lot of money." And she said something like, she said, "Well, let me tell you a couple things. The first thing is that foundations don't act together in projects. Each of us has our own mission silo. We certainly talk, but we have our own mission silos, and we don't act in harmony or in concert with each other." She talked about 9/11 and Katrina and other disasters. And she said, even in those, the foundations hadn't worked together. So, getting people to sort of get out of their mission silo and work together would be certainly unique. And then she said, and we don't work quickly either. And she said, even for small grants, like $25,000, $50,000, it can take a year to go through the granting process. And she said, so those are some problems. But she committed, Miriam Noland is who I'm talking about. She committed to, and I should say, Miriam is a power player in Detroit. She is connected with everything. And she is the author of many good works in Detroit. So when she talks, people listen. So she committed to talking to her colleagues around the country and seeing if there might be interested. And, she sent me an email with all their contacts. Late one night, I sent them at late, it was probably 9:00. I sent them all an email and asked them if they'd be willing to come to Detroit. I suggested a couple dates to listen to us. I told them I'd have the whole mediation team there. And I thought it would take about a week or two. These are busy, busy people. And within 18 minutes, my email pinged, and I got an email back from Darren Walker, who had been the president of the Ford Foundation, one of the largest foundations in the world. I think it's the second largest foundation of the world, saying he could be there at November 5th. And then right after that, they had obviously been talking. Every single one of them agreed. And on November 5th, we had a very large meeting in our court conference room with all my mediators there. And we talked about the bankruptcy and made the pitch. And it was a very robust conversation, very robust. In fact, Miriam had invited some of the out-of-town folks to a dinner at her house, including me and Eugene, after the meeting. And she had emailed me and asked me how long I thought the meeting would take. I said, well, it starts at 4:00. I can't imagine it'll go much beyond 5:30, maybe 5:45. At 7:30, we were still going. Then I could see Miriam texting her caterer. So it was a very robust conversation, very robust conversation. And, it sort of went from there. I had many conversations with the foundation leaders